Good evening, good afternoon to everybody joining us today in the final workshop in the series of the workshops that we have organized for the online course, The Future is Public. We've discussed so many interesting topics. In particular, much emphasis has been on the urgent need to transform public services to make them more democratic and accountable and strengthen the public ethos. And today we're wrapping up. So we are very, very happy to have with us Euan Gibb from Public Services International, stationed in Latin America, in Brazil, more specifically. Euan is one of the first graduates of the Global Libre University. So we are especially happy to have a graduate of the Global Libre University and alumni to actually be talking to us today. So Euan, we haven't had too many discussions in Latin America. Language is an obvious barrier, so we are really, really happy to have you today to perhaps put a bit of more light into what's happening in Latin America in terms of the struggles of the workers and their organizations to transform public services there. And perhaps you tell us also what exactly is your position at the PSI, so everybody knows, get to know you. Thank you so much for your time.
Right on. Thanks very much, Elira. Good afternoon, good evening to those of you outside of Latin America. Good morning to anyone who is here in the region. As Elira mentioned, my name is Euan Gibb. I'm based here in the regional office of Public Services International. So I'm in Sao Paulo in Brazil. PSI, very, very briefly, Global Union Federation represents about 30 million workers, a little bit over 700 affiliates from all over the world in 154 different countries. And so some of you maybe even have worked for or are part of unions or have been members of unions that are affiliated to PSI in some way. Just very briefly, who do we represent? We represent workers in the health sector, utilities, so water and energy, local and regional government workers, legislative, fiscal auditors that work in the public sector, education support workers. I am here in the regional office of PSI in Sao Paulo in the region that we call Inter-America. And so that's from the top of Canada down to the bottom of Argentina. And look, I'll tell you guys, it's actually it's a really exciting time. It's never like a quiet and calm time in Latin America, but it's actually a really exciting time to be working in this region. I mean, you think just about where I live here in Brazil with the return of the Lula government, defeating Bolsonaro, there's a word for the movement that supports that group of ideas that Bolsonaro represents, Bolsonarismo. And so we haven't defeated Bolsonarismo. All of those people still exist. There's still a very strong movement of the extreme right in Parliament, in the Senate and in Congress here in Brazil, which limits a lot of what a government like Lula can do. But still, it's a very exciting time to have this kind of leadership, and we've had some great wins, including really up-to-date recent equal pay for work of equal value legislation that we're now working to implement. We're working directly with the Lula government on several different files. I mean, there's comrades from the union movement who go directly into the health ministry and the labor ministry. Our labor minister comes right out of the central, the labor central here, the CUT. And so there's many good examples of things like that in Brazil. But you look to Colombia, the first progressive government in the history of that country was with Gustavo Petro. We've been able to do some really good and positive work with our affiliates, taking delegations from the health sector, from different unions in Latin America to participate in developing concrete proposals for health reform, tax reform, labor legislation that we've been able to win in Colombia. You look at Chile with the Boric government, and you look at the most recent example, which is Mexico. We're really optimistic about the work that we're going to be able to do in Mexico. We don't live in ideal worlds, but these were the best options out of much worse options. And so hopefully we're going to be able to advance further on a lot of the priority files that we have in Mexico. But guys, honestly, we have the opposite as well. Look at the Milei government in Argentina. We're in a terrible situation, right? This is some of the worst attacks we've ever seen against trade unions and trade union rights in Argentina. Next month, we're organizing a big international seminar. We're going to be bringing many affiliates to Buenos Aires, to Argentina, to organize a seminar and talk about trade union rights in this context. Our Argentinian comrades at the International Labor Conference, which is happening this week in Geneva at the International Labor Organization. They're denouncing the labor legislation changes. They're organizing, and we're supporting them in those forums, in forums that we organize, but in also any other institutional forums where we can. Look, what I wanted to talk about today, share with all of you today, was three concrete cases briefly that I'll outline these three cases. One case, the first one, is about defending good quality public services. Because when we think about public services, we think, okay, what's our vision for public services and where do we want to go? This is really the question that Elira put to me. She said, we want to look at some examples of what are aspirational models of public services. But I think it's important to recognize and value cases of existing good public services. And so I'll talk briefly about one of those cases. Second, I'll talk about a really positive and radical proposal. PSI, we've organized a global campaign on care work. And this is really radical in the sense that it goes to the basics of how capitalism works and challenges some of the basic social organization of workers when it comes to models of capitalism. And so I'll share a little bit about that. And then a third, very briefly, a case about how we're going to get there. So what do we actually do? We have these aspirations, we have these ideas, but how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to do this at the end of the day? The first case, I'll share 3 links in the chat after this intervention, and each link refers to each of these stories. So you can follow up on these stories. You can get in touch with Edlira. She can share my email with you. I can share my contact info if you want any further information about these stories after having had a look at, oh, okay, I understood what you guys were trying to do about this. Seems like an interesting case. And so if you want more details, please get in touch afterwards. I'll share one link about each of these 3 different stories. The first story is about public water and sanitation in the city of Rio de Janeiro. Everybody understands, I think, in this room that we have a human right to water. For us, in terms of PSI, our understanding of these kind of energy, health, these are human rights that we're talking about. Workers and citizens the world over have a human right to fresh, clean drinking water. And so how do we guarantee that right? Through public services. You could work for a privatized company. This happens many times in PSI and energy and health, where workers actually work for private for-profit companies, but they're providing these essential public services, which we understand to be human rights. And so their home is in PSI. So you think many times about Public Services International, this global union federation. Oh, okay, that's all workers who work for the government. No, that's not the case. It's workers who provide public services. Their home is in PSI. And so we have this dialogue always and a tension sometimes between privatized public services and who still works for state organized public services. Of course, these are dynamics that we deal with every single day with our affiliates. The public water system in Rio was never perfect. It was underfunded. It was the government spent money on other priorities that were clear rather than putting new water pipes. But it was a system where water was taken up into favelas, so into the poorest and most racialized communities in Brazil. Water was being taken up into those communities, and water was being cleaned coming out of those communities. And that was the public system that was doing that. And they were doing that without taking any money out of that, out of those neighborhoods. Why is a public water entity able to do that? Because of horizontal financing. This is a model that we use constantly in the public services where, okay, people are paying for a public service and governments are organizing that public service, and it actually makes money in some neighborhoods, and you lose money in other neighborhoods. And so that horizontal subsidizing of public services is something that only the government can do. And so when you take elements of that and you privatize it, you destroy the capacity of the government to do that horizontal subsidizing to provide those essential public services, which are human rights, into poor and racialized communities. And so there was this movement during the Bolsonaro years, at the end of the Bolsonaro mandate, to privatize everything that they possibly could. They mobilized the national public bank to facilitate these privatizations. And that's exactly what happened in the state of Rio de Janeiro. This state legislator voted to continue to preserve the public water services in the public system. The federal government, with local allies, exploited these divisions, these political divisions at the state level, and forced this privatization through. It was illegal. It was completely illegal. And the state legislature voted against doing it. The public was completely against it, but they forced it through. And so what happens is, this is what happens in every country, right? Where they break off these profitable blocks and they sell them to international private investors, often big investment funds. In this case, one of the blocks was won by the public pension fund of the Canadian working class. So the Canadian workers have this fund that they pay into and they want to retire. There's this fiscal responsibility, this fiduciary duty that they call it, the managers of this pension fund. We have to make 7 or 8% returns, da, 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 da. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, gets up and says, we're doing green sustainable investments. We're not investing in jails in the US or in arms or in tobacco, but here we are investing in green sustainable investments to provide more water to Brazilians. Oh, it sounds great, right? But then you talk to the workers and you talk to the union that represents these workers, and the reality, of course, is something else. They start cutting off the poor and racialized communities. They increase the water bills for people, so people have to pay more for what they were getting much cheaper before, even in the richer neighborhoods. There was an active sabotage and a poisoning of the water system in Rio, which caused this algae explosion in the system. And then people said, oh, look, public services don't work. So it's a really clear example of where the public was against this. They supported their public water company. They understood that it wasn't perfect, but that it was much better than the alternative. But in that political moment, they were able to push something like this through. And so as PSI, we got the affiliates in the north and the affiliates in the south, all together, working together on this file, but still we lost this fight. We lost this fight. Okay, you always learn something in the fight. You always consolidate contacts in these kinds of fights, but the water system got privatized at the end of the day. I mean, we have a guide in PSI, which you can find on our website, of how to defend and bring public services back under public control. But the first step always is to try to prevent privatization. And so we lost that fight and it got privatized, the public water system in Rio de Janeiro, in the city of Rio. But lessons were learned, of course, always. And contacts were made and we continue that fight. But it's a very clear example of where there was a good public services, a good public service being offered that had broad support of the public, but then was completely undermined and privatized. And so this is a story which highlights the importance of defending public services, and the first step is to prevent them from being privatized. The second case, which I want to briefly share, is about care and care work. We've launched a global movement a couple of years ago, and we continue to build this global movement calling for the rebuilding of the social organization of care. So what does that mean? It means understanding care and care work, the social and economic value of both paid and unpaid care work, and again, centralizing this as a human right. So people's human right to have access to care. Of course, we understand this and we work with this and organize on the basis of this gendered and racialized division of labor. It's principally women and racialized women that are doing this work. And we emphasize in the premise of this global campaign that, okay, you can talk about your economic indicators and you can talk about your economy, but none of the rest of the economy exists without these care workers doing this systematically undervalued and highly exploitative work. And so we highlight that the current organization is unbalanced, this current organization of the social organization of care work is unbalanced, it's unequal, and of course it's completely unsustainable. in the context of neoliberalism, austerity, the government is always going to claim and continues to claim, oh, we have no money. Of course, we can't bring all these workers and pay them good enough money. Who suffers the most with this is always women, and particularly racialized women in these social constructions, right? And so the government constantly claims, oh, of course, we don't have any money. We're cutting budgets. There's no way to properly fund the system. Of course, we would love to, but totally impossible. You guys are dreaming, right? And so for us, this is fundamentally linked to the third story, which I'll talk about in a moment, which is our tax work, the work that we do on taxes. And so if we don't resolve that problem, of course, no government will ever have money. We need to understand that. We need to organize in that political space. We need to work on that with our affiliates and with the public in general. And so what's the central demand of the CARE campaign? It's that states resource care as a public good and a collective social responsibility, instead of, and in contrast to, the existing understanding of care work, which is that it's a household's private responsibility, which predominantly, almost exclusively in many cases, falls to women. And so we built this campaign around 5 R's. So what are these 5 R's, which are the core demands of the campaign? First is recognize. That's the first R. So recognizing the social and economic value of care work, paid or not, and that human right to care that everybody has. Second is to reward, remunerate, and represent care workers. Understand this as professionalized work. Work that's organized on the basis of equal pay for work of equal value, that workers have adequate pensions, social protection, healthy and safe working conditions. They have the right to organize and collectively bargain. All of the social dialogue and the ILO's, the key components of the ILO's decent work agenda. So that reward in all of that comprehensive sense for care workers. Third, reduce the burden of unpaid care work on women. And so what does that lead directly to? The fourth R, which is redistribute. Redistribute care work within households among all workers and eliminate the sexual division of labor, the extremely unequal sexual division of labor between households and the state. And then finally, the fifth is reclaim. So reclaiming the public nature of care services and restore the duty and responsibility primarily of the state to provide public care services and develop care systems. Systems is key, that transform gender relations and women's lives, including by financing states' capacity to invest through fair and progressive taxation. We'll get to the third one, or the third story here about taxation, in order to guarantee that we're taxing in a way, the governments can tax in a way that actually provides the possibility to build comprehensive care systems. The comrades that are part of the delegations at the International Labor Conference that's happening this week at the ILO, one of the key themes that we're talking about at the ILO this week is care and care workers. So we've organized delegations in PSI of key affiliates to actually go to Geneva and go into those spaces and make sure that their voices are being heard inside the ILO. If you want to talk about care, we need these women at the table. You need to hear from them. You need to hear their voices about what care work actually means and not have bureaucratic, theoretical discussions about care. We need to bring that reality into those kinds of spaces. And so that's precisely what we're doing this week at the ILO. We've done a whole bunch of work. First, preparing the debates internally with our affiliates, but then them organizing at the national level to lobby their government delegates that participate in the ILO, in this tripart system inside the ILO. And so they're there, they've done that lobbying work, they're participating in those discussions. And this is based on direct and concrete work that we're doing in the Americas. We've got 3 clear examples in Colombia, in Chile, in Brazil, where PSI affiliates are organizing directly proposals for care systems and doing the lobbying work and making the concrete proposals with their government representatives. And so we're directly engaged in that work. In those three cases, I can talk a little bit more, expand on that if anybody's interested in particular in that. But there's lots of really good information on PSI's website about this campaign, about the concrete work that we're doing on proposals proposals for care systems and how to finance them in each of those three cases, but in other countries outside of the region, of course, as well. A lot of good work in India, in Bangladesh, in Southeast Asia as well, and in Africa too. We've got several examples of care work that's being done there, particularly in Kenya, but some other cases as well. So getting very briefly, I'll very briefly talk about the third story, which is the SICTAR. I don't know if anybody's heard of SICTAR, the work that SICTAR does before. That's the acronym for the Center for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research. We understood some years ago in PSI that if we want to talk seriously about taxes, it can't just be our affiliates and PSI leadership getting up and saying, everybody needs to pay more taxes if we want to have more public services. Okay, everybody's on board with this? Of course, this is not an argument we can make. And so we needed to come up with an innovative way to do this. And actually, it's really smart and really strategic. Some of the solutions, the creative solutions that we've come up with as PSI jointly with our affiliates to deal with this problem. One of them was the creation of this independent institute, this group called SICTAR. What does SICTAR do? SICTAR does research into corporate tax practices. And so they look in a detailed way. These are the guys who know how to look at the spreadsheets. They know how to look at the financial reports. They know how to look at the legislation, do an analysis, see where the gaps in the legislation are so that corporations can say, of course, we're following the law, but are they following the spirit of the law? Of course not. They're violating it, and they're leaking profits out of countries where they would pay taxes to pay no taxes at all. One of the really clear cases in the early win for SICTAR on this was Exxon. Exxon, this petrol company, this oil company operating in Australia, had billions in revenue in Australia, in a context of providing gas in Australia where gas prices were going up, provoking inflation. They were paying zero taxes in Australia, despite billions in revenue. So our SICTAR comrades, jointly with the affiliates of ITF, the International Transport Federation, a sister global union federation, their affiliates in Australia had a really tough dispute. The workers were not being able to negotiate a collective agreement. The company was trying to union bust. They said, no, we don't even want to talk with them. And so what do we do with SICTAR? We link worker struggles on the ground with these tax practices so that we can mobilize not only the workers at that base, but change the broad public debate about this and expose the practices of these companies in union busting and anti-union practices, but also in their tax practices simultaneously. So we can politicize this and make a bigger issue of this to expose these companies. And so what did we do with this? We did a report on this in SICTAR and exposed the company's practices. They were claiming they were borrowing money from their own organization in Delaware, in the United States, in the northeast of the United States, where they paid zero tax. They borrowed money from themselves through a separate legal entity to say, we have no profits. Of course we don't have any profits. We have to pay off all this debt. And so they rack up all this debt, but it's debt to themselves at the end of the day. And so they claim zero profits. And so we were able to change legislation. We got Senate hearings in Australia, changed legislation to bring billions of dollars back in to the public accounts in Australia. So a really good and solid early win for SICTAR. And so that's the model that we've been applying in other instances. We just hired 6 months ago a young, really smart comrade here in the region. She's fantastic, who has just released her first report here in Latin America. So we're staffing up a little bit in SICTAR here in the Americas to do more studies in Latin America about these companies, particularly the northern companies and their tax practices linked directly to worker struggles. The second biggest energy generation company in Colombia was privatized, and who bought it was a private equity fund called Brookfield, which some of you might have heard for. It's a global fund. It's one of the biggest in the world, and it's based in Canada. And so Brookfield bought this second biggest energy generation company in Colombia. So it was privatized. We disputed it. We fought it with Canadian comrades coordinating the struggle. It was privatized. And what have they done? They've claimed the same thing that Exxon had done. It's the model, right? So they set up this separate legal entity. They borrow money from that entity, and then they funnel all of their profits to that to pay off this fake debt. That's like precisely what this company has done. So the same thing, the reliability of the energy generation going down, the prices of energy skyrocketing, provoking increased intensification of inflation in Colombia, at the same time paying absolutely no taxes. And so we launched this study 2 weeks ago in Colombia at a regional meeting of affiliates who represent energy workers, got a few senators there, and the senators were saying, like, why don't we launch this in the Senate? These are the opportunities you have when you have more progressive governments in these kinds of openings, right? And so we're going to organize a public launch inside the Senate in Colombia as well, and try to really bring this back under public control and get these private capital actors out of essential public services. And so the next research piece that our comrade here that's working for SICTAR in Latin America is to have a deeper dig into the private care companies. We're seeing private equity not only in energy and water, we're seeing these guys in care and in the healthcare sector as well, particularly in the United States and in some other countries like Brazil, where they buy up these companies and then we see exactly what they do. They break them up into pieces, take as much as they can in terms of the whatever they can sell, and they run off with the loot, destroying and undermining the construction of quality public services which respect and fundamentally represent an expression of people having their basic human rights respected. I'll hold it there with those three different but complementary examples, and we open it up for a broader discussion now. Lyra, if you'd like to facilitate that, it would be great. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Euan. So inspiring and so interesting developments, and I think perhaps it was really a good idea to have you at the end to wrap up the conversations. So really, it's open. We have about 35 minutes to discuss with you, and who would like to ask a question? There were a few comments in the chat box, but who would like to take the floor to either make a comment or a question to Euan? Yes, Ian, please.
Yes. You mentioned about financing and taxes. What is PSI view in terms of the 15% flow on global corporate profits with respect to profits for multinational corporations?
Thanks a lot, Ian. Yeah,
we've done a lot adequate?
No, we don't. Of course we don't. I mean, we support it, and it would be an advance, a consolidation and an advance. We have supported it publicly. Our General Secretary, Danny Bertosa, has participated in the OECD meetings where this is being debated. But of course, I mean, one of the key pieces for this is not only the tax rate. As long as you have all these legal loopholes where, okay, it's a 15% tax rate or it's a 12% tax rate, but if they're not paying any tax, the debate about the tax rate is meaningless at the end of the day, right? And so we need to close these loopholes. And this is what we've been doing with a lot of affiliates. The affiliates know where these loopholes are better than anyone else. And so when we can coordinate this work and politicize this work and say, look, here's this loophole about them offshoring their profits or setting up these fake debt to themselves, and paying that off, until we close those loopholes, the debate about 15%, yeah, it's important, and it's important to politicize that at the global level, and it's important to knock on the door of our own national governments to make sure, but it's really the substantive work that we're doing, Ian, is much more focused at the local level on closing these loopholes to make sure they're actually paying the taxes and exposing them when they're not.
And just to say, we did have a video lecture from SICTAR in one of the courses.
Great.
From the comrade in Australia. And
Jason.
You may remember the example in Kenya that we had in the health chapter about the struggle of KMPDU, made use also of SICTAR in terms of analyzing this opaque financial arrangements between the private corporations and the government in the procurement of health facilities. Any other questions or comments? I see, Ian, that you commented about this horizontal financing also in Antigua and Barbuda, and that now the government is starting to look at PPPs, which we hope we have made enough arguments during the different conversations why it should be opposed. But yeah, I thought you wanted to say something. Sorry for that.
No problem. Hi, everyone. Well, as you see in my name, I'm from Argentina, so the discussion on privatizations is very strong right now. And what I've been discussing with one comrade, with Nico, you all know him,
Easy.
is this idea that I think that to resist privatization, we need to have like a bigger platform of resistance, not only trade unions. And I think that for some reason, people still think of the public services as essential, but the artificial intelligence and all of these things that are going on are changing the idea of us workers in the public sector as needed. Like, it's not that they don't want the services, they don't want us working on them. So I think that we have there some discussion point that it's very hard to manage. Like, how do we resist? For instance, yesterday, the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, said that they were going to use the Google artificial intelligence to regenerate the state, the structure of the state, of the public sector. So I think that we have a strong discussion there with technologies, and that I don't know if the PSI has a campaign about that, or I know that with the ITF we've been discussing this, but I don't know about the PSI in general, if you are discussing about this.
Yeah, Alejandra, un gusto. Gracias por la pregunta. Look, the work on digitalization started in PSI 8 or 9 years ago. We have today the biggest open and public database of collective bargaining clauses on digitalization. We have done so much education work around digitalization, both from the perspective of simultaneously from the perspective of protecting workers' rights and guaranteeing that those are respected, but simultaneously, what does this mean for the organization of the state? What does this mean for public services? How they're provided? What are the consequences of telling nurses in a hospital to give patients a tablet and send them home and say, "Oh yeah, monitor your heart rate here," get them out of the hospital? Like, what are the consequences of that? What are the politics around that? How do we protect workers' data? And in terms of how work is restructured and organized, but simultaneously, what are the consequences of that for public services? And so we do that in a systematic way in PSI. I'll share the link also with you, with everybody here, on what are the key resources for digitalization for trade unions. And that's not only, of course, for PSI affiliates. That's for everyone. That's going to be something that's a really rich resources for unions in every sector.
Thank you very much, Euan. Any other questions or comments? And please, it would be great if you put the cameras on, so at least we can see the faces. Yes, Benji, please.
Hi, everyone. Yeah. My question is, in the Philippines, the state does provide some services, but it is usually tied to what can be called patronage networks. So, for example, if you need a referral to a hospital, you could get that, but you had to pass through what's called the ward leader at the local level, which is tied to public officials, either to the mayor or to your local deputy of parliament. So and it's very strong here in the Philippines. So it's actually like part of how corruption persists, political dynasties survive, and also how politics remains like bankrupt or rotten. So I don't know, do you see the same thing in the Americas or Latin America? And how would you say that overcoming this patronage networks, turning services into being accessible and affordable, being of quality, does that also tie into a broader struggle to democratize politics? Yeah, I hope you got the point.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I don't know intimately the system of delivery of public services and the implications of patronage. We don't deal with it a lot in Latin America. There's a little bit of it, depending particularly when there's at the municipal level, when there are mayors who are more oriented towards that kind of approach to delivery of public services. But of course, all of us understand that the reason that unions are attacked in the way that we are is because we are the largest organized force that defends democracy, defends democracy at the level of the state and democratic participation of citizens and workers as citizens, but also challenges the state as the employer, and tries to expose those patronage networks and change the construction of how public services are delivered to try to democratize that. We work on that directly with our affiliates around the world to guarantee equal access to quality public services and be accountable for that. I mean, when you talk to the members, when you talk to the elected leadership at the local level, this is often one of their biggest frustrations, right? Is the way that they're excluded systematically by public sector managers who have adopted these private sector metrics and private sector approaches to management. I mean, we see this everywhere, right? Where it's not only the privatization of public services, it's the importation of the private sector logic into the delivery of public services in the public sector. It creates this kind of organic pressure for these managers. And so our local leaders say, like, this is extremely frustrating, right? We want to guarantee public and equal access to these public services, but it's being frustrated by things like patronage networks and the importation of this logic of the private sector management practices into the public sector. But I don't have a recipe where I can say, oh, look, we have a really good example where we defeated the patronage networks, and here you can take this to the local context and use this model to defeat it.
Thanks, Euan. We have Kato from Senegal, I think. You want to try? Perhaps it works this time.
I hope it will work. Thank you very much. Hello, Euan. I'm from PSI. I'm from the African Arab region. Yeah, I'm a project coordinator in the African Arab region, and I'm very happy to hear you talking about our work. And I just want to add things in that is happening in Africa.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, about the privatization we are facing, particularly in water. I want to give a concrete example of what was happening in Cameroon. I was coordinating a project on water privatization in Cameroon. The project was funded by another union from Canada, Coupe, and we had private company managing the water system in Cameroon for 10 years, and it was a disaster. As I said yesterday in Senegal, it was really a disaster. And in 2020, the government decided to renationalize the water company. But you know how our government in Africa are, and also how IMF and World Bank are pushing, getting some pressure on them to privatize the essential services, the public services. So what we wanted in that project is that to not give the opportunity to the government to reprivatize the water company. So what we did there is that we formed, first of all, a network, a big network, not just with union. We have unions, we have civil society organization, we have journalists, we have, at the end, we had MPs, we had a lot of people, a traditional chief, religious group, youth group, women group, and all that. We had a really big network. Anyway, in the country, talking about how the privatization is bad. Because, you know, in Africa, oh, my internet, can you hear me?
Yeah, you were stopped for a moment, but you are back now. You're back now.
Can you hear me? Is it
Yeah,
better?
you're back. Just continue.
Okay, good. As I said, the thing is,
we lost you again.
Really know the danger of privatization. how dangerous it is, and how we have to also give them the solution, because there is a solution. My colleagues talked about taxes. There is taxes, also there is funding in the own countries. In the big investment in water services are done by the government. We had to show to people that what they said that the private company is doing it, the private company is not doing it. It's the government that is doing it. It is your money through the taxes you are paying. So that's how they are doing this investment. So why will they privatize it? And you know that when they privatize it, they are only looking for profit they are having. They are not looking for the benefits of the population. So we have to keep it in the public hand and to manage it very well, so that it will stay in our hand and it will benefit directly to the people. I'm happy that Euan share the POP platform. It's really a very interesting platform where you can have a lot of example of privatization, a lot of material out there, so you can know more about privatization. You can have some tools to fight against privatization. Thank you very much. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, really. Thanks so much, sister. Sarbasara, did I see your hand up? Yes, please, go ahead.
Good evening. Actually, just I wanted to know about the situation in rural areas, because in India, right now we have a very hard summer season, and a lot of water crisis in the rural areas, especially drinking water. And in many parts of the country, we don't have a public water supply. Forget about the private sector. So just I wanted to know what is the situation in other part of the globe, because I think these issues of privatization is pertaining to the urban areas, even in India also. But many people still live in the rural areas. For drinking water, they don't have any sources, either from public or private. They just manage themselves. And in many cases, the women actually, they suffer a lot for collecting the drinking water. And also there is problem with water for washing clothes and taking baths, and for the domestic animals, etc. So just I wanted to know what is the situation and another part of the globe.
Yeah, I mean, we fight privatization in so many different ways. This is something that's organically part of our work. Not only fight to limit privatization and prevent it, but then fight to bring public services back under public control, but then simultaneously fighting to expand the reach of public services. Of course, this is a part of all of our struggles. And so these are struggles which, if you take a look on PSI's website, there's struggles that are happening simultaneously in all regions all over the world. One of the things that I wanted to highlight, I participated a couple of weeks ago in a meeting that the regional office of the World Bank, there's a very small office for dispute settlement. It's small and independent inside the World Bank system. 2 years ago, for the first time, the World Bank's internal orientations for those that access World Bank funds for funding privatizations, often, we have the core labor standards. An explicit requirement that the core labor standards are respected in the World Bank documents for the first time. And so this small office of dispute resolution inside the World Bank can be a space when we're working in our regions, when there's World Bank finance, World Bank money being used to facilitate these privatizations. This is one. It's a complementary mechanism that we can use to guarantee workers' rights and to politicize further violations of workers' basic rights to organize, the core labor standards recognized in the Declaration on Workers' Rights, the 1998 Declaration. So right to organize, no discrimination, no child labor, no forced labor, right? And so it's one more mechanism that we can use that's kind of overreaching and overarching, because the actual the possibility to limit the political demands of the World Bank and IMF to continue along this privatization and PPPs and all of this, we haven't been able to prevent it, right? They continue along those lines, and so we'll open up other fronts in the struggle wherever we can, even in their own house. wherever we can. But these are fights that are constant and ongoing. I'll find the most recent iteration of the kind of manual for organizing struggles against privatization and bringing public services back under democratic public control, and share that link with everybody here as well.
Thanks very much, Euan. Any? Yeah, we read in the chat about push for privatization of the World Bank in Senegal too. Euan, you are at the heart of the participatory budgeting schemes, which perhaps are not that popular anymore in Sao Paulo, but they were once the famous really setting the example of how actually how one could make public service more participatory and democratic, including in the questions of budgeting. What's going on with that? Do you see any revival of such schemes, but not just in Brazil, but more generally? So one of the arguments that David Hall makes is that when we are looking at the transformation of public services, we could find a way of bridging, strong elements of public services in the north with this very inspirational stories of actually transforming public services in the south, in particular about participation of workers and communities into shaping the public services. So what do you see there along those lines? Are things, is South, and particularly Latin America, the region where, these inspiring stories are still coming up when it comes to public services?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Adlira. And it's, I mean, when you look from the outside, it's like, okay, there was this this emergence of a model of public participation in how public money gets spent. And then it kind of disappeared, which is not accurate. It's not accurate in the case of Brazil, which I have much more contact with, experience directly with, but also in some other countries in Latin America. Look, the post dictatorship constitution of Brazil, the 1988 constitution of Brazil, includes mechanisms for public participation in the construction of the public health system, in the construction of the public education system. And so this is a really incredible model that I took a look, and there's very little available in English about this model, particularly like this incredible public health system that we have. It's mixed, it's uneven. In some cities, it's much better. The SUS, we call it, the Sistema Único de Saúde, which is like the unitary, the exclusive public system, which should provide public health services across the entire country. And so it's underfunded, and it's weak in some places, and it's fantastic in other places, but does a really, really good job in some areas. The public health system in Brazil organizes elections at the municipal level and sets up counselors, like a system of counselors at the city level, at the municipal level. And they participate in actually defining the priorities, but then actually monitoring the implementation of the public health system, including looking at the books at the municipal level. And that group elects counselors to go to the state level. And there's that same thing at the state level. And then they elect to go to the national level. And that national meeting, with over 800 elected delegates, I participated in that meeting last year. It is an incredible space. Like, you look at this room of almost 1,000 people that are defining the priorities. There's indigenous people there, LGBT people there, like making proposals. It's like a union meeting in some ways, right? Because you make those proposals, you defend those proposals, you vote on those proposals. And that's happening all along the course of the year. And then actually with access to the financial reports of the public health system, people are debating the concrete implementation of the public health system. And so it makes sense, Adlira, that something like the participatory model of budgeting that emerged and became famous globally happened in Brazil, because it was already happening sectorally. It continues to happen sectorally. So it's not something that emerged and disappeared for us. It's something that emerged at the municipal level in a broader way, in a more systematic way when you think about public services, when you think about the management of a municipality. It happened in a structurally in a more systematic way and then reduced. But really, the emergence of it makes a lot of sense in Brazil because of our experience with doing it systematically in the health system and in the education system. They're incredible models. There's not a lot of research about these in other languages, but when you talk to Brazilians, when you talk particularly, our trade union leaders get elected in this system. They run for those positions at the local level, they run at the state level, and then they run nationally. And so one of the reasons I went to participate in this meeting was to organize like a PSI group of our affiliate leaders inside that system, so that we were making sure we have this global plan of action in PSI. We take that to the regional level and have a regional plan of action. But how do we prioritize those joint and collective priorities? How do we actually put those into practice? And so that was part of my job, was to make that bridge between the global and regional plans of action and the actual implementation and monitoring of the implementation of the public health system in Brazil with our affiliates. And so what are the kind of proposals that they're going to put on the table? What are the kind of proposals they're going to support from others? It's a really incredible and rich and diverse democratic space that is talked about very, very little. But it's one of the reasons that we organized a delegation to Colombia a few months ago, time goes so fast, man. We're at the middle of the year already. In November, so over half a year ago already, organized a delegation from Chile, where the unions are directly involved in a health proposals for reforming the health system and bringing it back under public control in Chile. So leaders from our affiliates in Chile, we had leaders from Argentina, from UPCN, who were directly participating, because there's the unions involved directly in the delivery of public services in some cases, right? UPCN with all its contradictions. I see Alejandro smiling. And so the comrades from UPCN, the comrades from Chile, and the comrades from Brazil, to sit down and talk with the people that are directly involved in the health reforms in Colombia, where there's this crazy system of the government handing over public money to private for-profit companies to administer and distribute those resources to the local level, and extracting profit in the middle of it, right? How does this happen, right? But they get so rich doing this, and so they don't want to be taken out as the middlemen, and we're trying to get them cut out and say the public service would do this much better, right? In the horizontal financing, subsidizing, and all of this, we could actually potentialize cutting those guys out, which is what gets taken out as profit extraction from the public health system, right? It's like Chile, it's really heavily privatized. It's strategic, these three models that we wanted to present inside the Colombian parliament, and with the senators in the meetings and the meetings with our affiliates also, to politicize those discussions and present concrete alternatives that they can use as inputs into their debates nationally for their engagement with the reform process of the public health system in Colombia. So there are lots of examples at Lyra, but they're not like those kinds of one clear example that went internationally, became famous, and then kind of disappeared. It's happening, but it's not happening in the same kind of way. There's not that spirit of optimism of, oh, we have another model here, and we should promote it more. Actually, it's actually the question leads to a really good question about why aren't we promoting this more? Because workers are like workers. Working class people, workers, elected trade unions are participating in these kinds of decision-making, prioritizing, triaging what are the top priorities with limited resources, simultaneously fighting for more resources, but then monitoring the implementation and fighting for better implementation and more complete delivery of public services. That's happening, but we're not promoting it. We're not debating it as much as we should. We get caught kind of in the regional debates here, participating in those kinds of spaces, but don't lift it up as a banner to the rest of the world and say, hey, there's actually really good stuff going on here. You guys should pay more attention, right? But we should do that more at Lyra. I agree completely.
Yeah, I mean, one could think that just because it wanes in the literature, it doesn't mean that it's not happening anymore. It's just that
Absolutely.
there was a period in which so much was written about it. But I mean, that's where we have a great idea for another video lecture to add to this course, because it is a very
Yeah.
important scheme that can actually inspire trade unions in other parts of the world in terms of what can be actually done. I don't see any other hand raised, so I'm going to abuse my role as a chair for a final question, actually two questions. One, Euan, on the PPPs. We heard from David Hall in the first week of the workshops and in his video lecture, how even the World Bank and the IMF themselves have told the government that, you know, don't go for PPPs anymore. You can borrow much more cheaply as a government, and you can actually provide the services directly. What's the debate on that in Latin America? Has that picked up? I mean, have the unions picked up on that argument to actually use it? And the second one, I think it relates a bit to the questions the points you've been raising about the penetration of this new public management and of managerial kind of practices into the public services, and how that have led to also worker alienation at the workplace. So are there inspiring stories? Because one of the things we wanted to do with this course was also to look at new ways of how work can be organized. So involving workers in labor processes in a way that does not alienate them from the services that they are providing, because they're not producing machines, they are actually producing services for people. So is that also, are there examples where the unions are engaging with actually determining also labor processes in public services?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
perhaps we wrap up with this one because we
Sure.
are
Yeah.
10 minutes.
Got it. Yeah, we just got a few minutes. This document on public financing for local quality public services, it's not only for local public services. Like, you can generalize this and think about it in a broader way. But there's a bunch of concrete examples in that document. Daria, who coordinates our local and regional government sector inside PSI, did this really nice process of a broad and deep consultation with affiliates to pull these stories up. In both of these documents, actually, that Daria had her hands on, working directly on. She's done a great job in filtering what are the inputs, and then reorganizing and giving it back to affiliates as a resource. So this is some of the good work that the Global Union Federations do, all of them, which is to take the good examples that we have and try to spread them out more. Not to say, oh, we have the solution or we have the model, but we have a lot of things that we can be inspired by, and we have some concrete proposals, like the digital bargaining hub, on the collective bargaining clauses, like really specific concrete things like that. But then also, what are the arguments, right? Like your argument, Idlira, from David Hall that you're relating on, you could do this much cheaper and much better. We make those arguments, we promote those arguments with affiliates. One of the things that we've been promoting directly with affiliates is these public-public partnerships. And so when you have like a good water system that's working, how do we get them talking? When you have a good energy generation and distribution system that's working, where workers' rights are being respected and they're not being attacked, how do we share that example with others, right? That's one of the things we were doing in Colombia, in Bogota, when we launched this study that was in the context of a regional meeting for energy sector representatives. And I mean, the comrade from Bolivia, the president of the Federation for the Energy, for the Utilities Workers Confederation in Bolivia, gets up and he explains this. After the horizontal subsidizing financing role of the public energy system in Bolivia, they provide and distribute a public policy, a public program on subsidizing poor families. And so providing money from the public energy system directly to the poorest families in Bolivia. And so when you want to talk about privatizing the system, you're going to have to say, we want to take money away from old people and poor people and young people. You're going to have to make that argument if you want to. And so these are really smart, strategic policies that unions have proposed and implemented that should be shared with others. I mean, I highlighted it in the meeting. I was like, did everybody hear that? Like, that's really smart and strategic. Like, you're going to have to attack the pensioners, and you're going to have to attack young students. like childhood, like children, and say we want to take the money away from them if you want to privatize. And so you're doing the horizontal subsidizing in the more macro sense, but then to do these kinds of public policy and public partnerships from PSI perspective, there's a lot to learn from these examples, and we need to do more sharing of these kinds of examples. But the last two documents I shared here do exactly that. They share good concrete examples and relate the stories of in some detail about how those successes are built. And so the sharing is in both of those documents. But there's other sharing also that's on the site. If you guys have a look and dig around a little bit, there's some really good, not only the examples of, oh, everything is really shit, everything is really terrible. Look what happens. Like we have those stories about the insertion of private finance into the care system. We have those documents, we have those stories and those reports, but we also have many, many good, concrete, positive proposals. I was in a meeting yesterday where we were talking about examples of where public pensions, which they have the pension managers I mentioned, they have this fiduciary duty. They have to guarantee this return on investments. Okay. Look in the north where there's inflation for the first time. Here in Latin America, we're used to the high levels and fluctuating levels of inflation. There in Canada and the US, they're much less used to it. And so they're freaking out about the increased costs in housing, So use this pension fund money instead of privatizing our public energy and water systems and health systems here in Latin America. Use it in your own backyard to build community housing, like to build more housing options and deal with your inflation crisis, but also have your return on investments, right? So we're talking about always in PSI about concrete positive proposals and making it easy for government. Like you arrive in these meetings with government and you say, look, here's an easy way for you to resolve this without screwing workers or without cutting people's access to, with actually increasing people's access to essential public services, including housing. So we're doing that kind of work all the time. And I want to thank you, Elira, for creating this space, and all of you for your questions, and thank all of you for the opportunity to share this space a little bit. It was really great to meet all of you, and let's stay in touch.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Euan. And I think we should perhaps pursue also the video lecture on Bolivia because it sounds really fascinating. And it's an opportunity for people to actually see examples and learn and bring those back home. And other innovative ideas may come out of that. Really, really thank you very much for your time, for the excellent discussions, really fascinating. Thanks everyone for the questions and comments and for your participation and for some of you faithfully being with us workshop after workshop. We are going to meet in other conversations. For now, we wish you all the best, lots of power to actually take up these ideas that we have been discussing in the course, in the Zoom workshops, into your own organizations.